So what came next were called the Intolerable Acts. This is a name thought up by the colonists, not the Brits. The leaders in London surely thought their actions were reasonable. The first was to completely shut down the port of Boston. No ships, no business, in or out. This was to stay in force until the Americans paid East India Company for the soggy tea and paid Parliament the taxes that were due on it. We assume this applied to the hard cider as well. The action was devastating to Boston's economy. The other colonies were outraged and soon began donating and transporting by land rice, wheat, sugar, flour, and even livestock to the beleaguered city. Boston called on all the colonies to support a complete boycott of British goods. A short time later came the Massachusetts Government Act of May 20, 1774. With this, the citizens lost their right to elect delegates to the Massachusetts legislature. The Crown got rid of those messy elections. Representatives would simply be appointed by the governor, who, of course, was appointed by the king.
And then they also forbade town meetings, which had developed over decades, that this was the way in which the Americans at Concord or wherever the town meetings, the various villages all around there, the Massachusetts Bay Area, that they were forbidden.
In addition, all local officials and local judges would be appointed by the governor. And in the near future, all members of juries were to be chosen by the local sheriff. And a couple of other things. If a British official was accused of a serious crime, they could be sent back to England to make sure they got a fair trial. Of course, that's ironic, remembering that the British soldiers charged with murder in the Boston Massacre were for the most part acquitted. There was also a new Quartering Act. This one required colonists to house and feed British troops in their private homes. Of course, this anger over quartering soldiers later became the Third Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But also related is that many colonists objected to the presence of a full-time standing army in the colonies.
What a lot of people don't realize is that the greatest fear of the founding generation, the framers of the Constitution, was the fear of a standing army. They would be horrified and deeply frightened by the military that we have today. Their example, what they wanted to protect against, was Julius Caesar marching in with his legions, crossing the Rubicon to overthrow the Roman Republic. That was their greatest fear, and that's what's reflected in the Third Amendment.
Keep in mind that from the colonist point of view, the British Army wasn't there to protect them from some foreign enemy. They assumed the British Army viewed them as the enemy. And there was one final bit of insult called the Quebec Act, which, among other things, proposed to give the French, whom they had recently defeated in war, large territories of land west of the Appalachians, which was denied to the colonists. The Americans saw this as a British attempt to get the colonists back at war with the French and the Indians. We have posed the question, what did the British do that ticked us off so much? Well, now we know. And taking all this into account, these English citizens, known as colonists, made one final point. The actions of the Crown and Parliament were a violation of their freedoms granted by the British Bill of Rights of 1689. It was all coming to a head. And there's one more interesting footnote. We've all heard the phrase taxation without representation, implying that the colonists were being taxed but had no elected representatives in the British Parliament. Was that true? Yes, it was. But the British had an answer to that charge. And the best way to explain it is to think about the modern-day computer games and the make-believe concept we call virtual reality. The leaders in London said the members of Parliament, duly elected in England, care about the colonies and are taking good care of you. Therefore, and this is the phrase they actually used, you have virtual representation in Parliament. Like the computer games, it was a make-believe world. Well, if we couldn't serve in Parliament, the colonists concluded, they would create their own. So in September 1774, some 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia and held what became known as the First Continental Congress. The main agenda of the First Continental Congress was about economic matters. In short, asking the king and Parliament to repeal the Intolerable Acts and treat them more fairly. They sent to London a petition to that effect. So about 8 months later, in May of 1775, they held the Second Continental Congress. Now, there were still colonial leaders who did not want to break with England, who still hoped for a settlement. In fact, the revolutionaries were likely a minority.
A lot of people didn't support the move towards revolution. John Adams later on estimated that a third of the population was for revolution, a third of the population opposed the revolution, a third of the population just put their finger to the wind and saw which way it was blowing. I think a lot of people in in the North American colonies really viewed themselves as part of the British Empire, that they benefited from the empire, they benefited in terms of their own trading relationships, in terms of their status, in terms of how they viewed themselves. And you have to remember, a lot of the American colonists who ended up supporting the revolution at first identified very closely with this British Empire. George Washington, for example, was always frustrated over the fact that he never could secure a commission in the British Army, that he continued to be a colonel in the Virginia militia. So there are a lot of people who see nothing wrong with what's going on, who do not see their rights as being compromised, who do not view themselves necessarily as equal Englishmen, or who benefit from the imperial relationship. They have no reason to get involved in this, and they see, in fact, a war against the empire as perhaps a revolutionary war in other ways, a war against property, a war against their landed interests in places like the Hudson River Valley. So there are lots of people who say any conflict with Great Britain may bring in its wake other chaos, other tension, other stress that may disrupt the world that they've grown very comfortable with.
But even before the Second Congress met, there had begun a certain amount of shooting. An increased number of British troops arriving were finding themselves in conflict with various makeshift local militias. Of course, the most significant such conflicts were a month earlier, in April 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord, which marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War. It is important to note that at that time, the colonial revolutionaries did not have an army. You could say the Americans at the Second Continental Congress in May 1775 began preparing for war, but in reality, the war had already started a month earlier. On April 14, British General Thomas Gage, whose troops occupied Boston, received approval for a plan to arrest the key colonial leaders and confiscate the militia's weapons, which he believed were being stored in Concord, Massachusetts. On April 16th, he sent a scouting party out toward Concord to see what they could learn. The greatest effect of this scouting effort was to allow the militias to figure out what the Brits were planning. 2 days later, on the 18th, the general sent a 700-man force on the road to Concord. Of course, by this time, the colonists knew what was coming, had removed their armaments from Concord, and set up an early warning system as to where the British troops were. The British arrived first at the village of Lexington. The small militia was far outnumbered and decided not to attack. Still, a shot rang out and the British opened fire, killing 8 Americans and wounding 10. The British Army moved on to Concord and began searching for the militia's weapons. Now, the colonists stayed under cover. They knew the English wouldn't find much anyway. But what the militia was really doing was waiting for another nearby militia to arrive as reinforcements, which it did. Finally, the Americans engaged the British, inflicting casualties, and took some themselves. Then they pulled back and allowed the army to leave. The colonists had made the point that they could stand up and fight. But the day wasn't over. Letting the English leave, whether intentionally or accidentally, worked out well for the Americans. For all during the British long march back toward Boston, local militias hidden in the trees fired on the retreating troops. In total, the Massachusetts militia lost 50 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. The day, and especially the long march home, cost the British 73 killed, 173 wounded, and 26 missing. The fighting at Lexington and Concord proved to be the opening battle of the American Revolution. In May, the Second Continental Congress, again in Philadelphia, urged each colony to set up and train its own militia. And in June 1775, they voted also to establish an actual Continental Army. The unanimously selected commander-in-chief was to be George Washington of Virginia. Meanwhile, the British Army received reinforcements from England, bringing their numbers to 6,000 well-trained soldiers. And in mid-June 1776, there was developed a plan to send a force from the city to track down and destroy those rebels once and for all. The colonial commanders decided their best defense would be at the top of a place called Bunker Hill. They went there and started building fortifications. The British arrived and began an attack. The American commanders ordered their troops not to shoot until the Brits were very close. Thus, it would seem, came the phrase we've all heard, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." That approach worked very well, but the much larger British force attacked Bunker Hill 3 different times. Eventually, when the Americans ran out of ammunition, they retreated, and the British claimed victory, sort of. The battle cost the Americans 115 killed, 305 wounded, and 30 captured. But the British cost was immense, 226 killed and 828 wounded, totaling 1,054 casualties. It was a hollow English victory. With the recent fights at Lexington and Concord, and the Battle of Bunker Hill in progress, it was obvious that a Revolutionary War was a reality.